The 7-2. I have no idea. Of course, eventually.
So you have no idea, right?
Well, if you assume.
Yep.
Okay.
Because you didn't know this. So, if you assume?
Yep.
Right, yeah. Did I realize that eventually?
Of course. You have no idea.
I know, right? If you assume, definitely.
I know. If you assume, Julie. Definitely. How do we know this?
I don't know. It sounds a good point, definitely. And how do I know this?
I don't know. So, you assume?
Yep, if I assume, usually. So you assume?
Yep.
Right, yeah. Did I realize that visually?
Of course.
I know, right? So you assume?
Yep.
Right. You have no idea.
I know. So you assume?
Yep. If I assume, visually.
I know, right? So you assume?
Yep. Because I didn't know this. Definitely. If I assume, visually.
I know, right? So, if you assume?
Yep. If I assume, visually.
Of course.
You have no idea. Definitely.
Well, if you assume?
Yep. I guess you're right, I guess. If I assume, visually.
I know, right?
So, if you assume.
Yep.
Freya. Did I realize that visually?
Of course.
You have no idea. If you assume, visually.
I know. So you assume?
Yep. If I assume, visually. Because you didn't know this. So you assume.
Yep.
Freya. Did I realize that visually?
Of course.
You have no idea, right?
Well, if you assume visually?
Yep.
Okay. You have no idea.
I know, right? So you assume, visually.
Yep. Right. If I assume visually?
I know, right? So you assume.
Yep.
Right. You have no idea. So you could assume definitely. But I didn't know this. How am I gonna know this?
I don't know. So, you assume?
Yep. If I assume definitely.
Agree. But you have no idea, right?
Of course. So if you assume definitely.
Yep.
Freya. Did I realize that?
Of course.
You have no idea. So you assume, right?
Yep.
Freya. Did I realize actually? Of course. You have no idea. I know, right? If you could assume, Beasley. I know, right? You have no idea. Of course. Did I realize actually? Yep. If you could assume, Beasley. I know, right? If you could assume. Yep. Why, did I realize that? Of course. If you could assume, Beasley. I know, right? So, if I could assume. Yep. Why, did I realize that, Beasley? Of course. I know, why? So, if you assume, yep. Right, did I realize that, Virtually? Of course, you have no idea. If you assume, Virtually, I know. If I assume, Virtually, I know, why? So you assume? Agree, definitely. So you assume? Yep. Yep, because I didn't know this. Definitely. Of course. I know, right? If you assume, usually? Yep. Right. You have no idea. So you assume, usually? Yep. You have no idea. I know, right? If you assume, usually? I know. So if I assume? Yep. Okay. Because you didn't know this. If you assume, usually? Yep. Of course. I know, right? So you assume, usually? I know. So if you assume? Yep. Right, yeah. Did I realize that actually? Of course. You have no idea, right? Well, if you assume, usually? Of course. I know, so you assume? Yep. Because you did know this. If I assume, usually? Of course.
You have no idea.
I know, right? If you could assume, Julie?
Yep.
Why, the virus actually?
Of course.
You have no idea.
I know, why?
If you could assume, Julie?
I know.
So you could assume?
Yep.
Why?
If you could assume, Julie.
Of course. You have no idea. Definitely. But you could assume, right?
If you could assume, Julie.